Good day to you. My name is Alan Tidwell, and I'm the director of the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. And I'd like to welcome you to today's Blue Pacific Futures webinar. And today we're focusing on the question of the China-Solomon Islands Security Agreement. And this presentation is also being brought to you by the University of Hawaii in conjunction with the Georgetown University and my good friend, Associate Professor Tara Kabadalaka. Tara, I'm going to throw it over to you and let you introduce our panel.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, Nogata, or good morning, wherever you are. Aloha mai kako and warm greetings from Hawaii. As Alan mentioned, my name is Tarsisius Kabutaulaka, and I'm an associate professor at the Center for Pacific Island Studies here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'll be moderating this conversation with my colleague, Alan. First, let me acknowledge the Kanaka Maoli, the indigenous people of Hawaii, the land where I have the privilege and honor to live and work. I now mamana hamu atamanina vera neni Hawaii, a Kanaka Maoli mutalamania mahita horosai matutuhunu do. As you probably noticed, this webinar is recorded, but only the moderators and the panelists will appear in the recording. Another thing is that there is a Q&A function. So if you have questions during the conversation, please post it in there. And my colleague Alan will harvest it from there and will relay it to the panelists during the conversation rather than waiting until the end. As Alan also mentioned, this webinar talk story is part of our Blue Pacific series, which is co-organized by the Center for Pacific Island Studies here at UH Manoa and the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. Now, last month, the draft of a security agreement between Solomon Islands and China was leaked via social media. It has since been signed. The Solomon Islands government says it is diversifying its security partnerships to include China while maintaining its relationship with traditional partners like Australia, Aotearoa, and New Zealand. Prime Minister Honorable Manasseh Sogavare said Australia remains Solomon Islands security partner of choice. But that has not quelled anxieties in Canberra, in Washington, DC, in Wellington, and from other Western countries who are concerned about China's growing and assertive influence in the region and the potential for its military presence in Oceania. There has been a lot of discussions, as we all know. Now, this afternoon's talk story or conversation features four prominent Solomon Islanders. The first is Honorable Danny Phillips, who is a veteran politician who first entered Solomon Islands National Parliament in 1984, making him the longest serving member of Parliament in Solomon Islands. Over the years, he has served as Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Planning and Aid Coordination. He is currently the chair of Solomon Island Government's Foreign Policy Advisory Subcommittee and a government backbencher. The second is Honorable Peter KENILOREA Jr., who is in his first term as the Member of Parliament for East Are Are. Prior to being elected to Parliament in 2019, he served as Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And prior to that, he worked for the United Nations in New York for 17 years. He is currently the chair of Solomon Islands Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Relations and a member of the opposition. Dorothy Wickham is a highly experienced journalist and media and communications specialist with an in-depth understanding of Pacific Islands politics, cultures, and effective communication practices. She's a long-standing host of what was Ramsey's National Radio talkback program called Talking Truth, and managing editor of One News Television and founding editor of social media site Melanesia News Network. Dorothy is a trusted voice in Solomon Islands and the Pacific. And finally, my good friend, Dr. Transform Agorau, who is currently a professor at the Solomon Islands National University, as well as legal counsel for the Republic of the Marshall Islands Fisheries and CEO of iTuna Intel. He is the former CEO of the parties to the Nauru Agreement. He was Deputy Director of the Forum Fisheries Agency and legal counsel for the Pacific Islands Forum. Welcome to our panelists, and welcome to all of you who have joined us this afternoon. Let me begin by offering each of the panelists a minute or two to provide some opening comments on the security agreement between Solomon Islands and China. And let me see if Honorable Danny Phillips is not on yet. He's trying to get on the Zoom. So as soon as he comes in, he can join us. But let me begin with Honorable Peter KENILOREA Jr. And your initial thoughts on the agreement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tara, for that introduction. And it is an honor to be among the distinguished panelists for this series. So thank you very much for the invitation. Straight to your question in terms of my take on the treaty. It's one that, or the agreement, it's one that I feel we don't need at this time. It's one that is Solomon Islands as a nation won't benefit from it. I say that because of our size. We are 700,000, perhaps in the latest count, perhaps a little bit more than that. Our police is probably about 1,000 officers. The issues that have been affecting us have been centered and focused around the Honiara area. Much of Solomon Islands is still a peaceful country. Much of our problems recently that I heard was quoted in Parliament yesterday by the Prime Minister in announcing the treaty are linked to politics, political issues that have led to flare-ups and unrests. So I just don't think that a treaty or diversifying our security will add value to our current security arrangements and setups. So I, for one, don't condone or think that this was a path that we should take, and it's a path that would benefit Solomon Islands. For me, I think that the biggest winner here would be the People's Republic of China in terms of a foothold in the Pacific region through Solomon Islands. That is my initial take on this. And the reasons that it is a sovereign decision is something that I also dispute. When it comes to security, especially in this heightened geopolitical environment, it's more than a national issue. And the region is impacted, there are implications. So for me, I think the proof is that what was mentioned again yesterday by the Prime Minister, Honorable Sobabare, when he said at the end that the foreign minister will be doing rounds in the Pacific to explain this agreement. Now you don't do that for sovereign issues. We passed only one law over the last 2 years, which was a registration of SIM cards. We don't go around explaining that to all the members in the Pacific because that is a sovereign issue in the Solomons. But in order to do that, and by doing that, you are undermining the argument that it's a sovereign issue. It's not, and it's confirmed by the fact that you're sending a foreign minister to have to explain this again to the region. Thank you very much.
Hey, Tara, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Peter. It looks like Honorable Danny Phillips has joined us, so I'm going to hand it over to him for his initial comments. Honorable Danny Phillips, I think you're muted. We can't hear you. So those are the challenges with technology in the Solomons. As we're trying to get Honorable Danny Phillips on, oh, you're connected now, right? Still no audio. Okay, let me pull in Dorothy while Danny is trying to fix the audio. Dorothy.
Tara, for having me on the panel, and hello to my fellow Solomon Islanders who are also on the panel. I think for us in the media, the battle now is to ensure that the narrative is about Solomon Islands. I think most of the media coverage has been coming in from Australia, and I think local journalists here are struggling very much to ensure that the subject is about Solomon Islands and not about Australia or the American position on the treaty. And I think the Media Association has, over the last 10 years, struggled very much to ensure that Solomon Islanders are kept informed about issues that affect them. I agree with Peter that there are some things that need to be discussed with our neighbors and some things that don't need to be discussed. And I think the government's handling of the way it went about this treaty shows disrespect, I think, to Solomon Islanders, that there was no discussion, no consultation. Even a press release on the eve of the signing would have been a standard procedure. And until today, we have not had a press briefing or a press statement from the Prime Minister's office in regards to this signing of the treaty, or even what's in the treaty itself. So I think that's where the media is disappointed. And I was having a conversation with my fellow colleagues of the executive of the Media Association, and everyone was very disappointed at the behavior of the Prime Minister's office towards the way it's dealing with us. Because I think in times of COVID, in times of trouble, they lean towards the media to disseminate the information that they need to Solomon Islanders. And when shut us down, I think there was an incident outside Parliament yesterday where a cameraman and a journalist were halted for filming and accessing Parliament grounds. Even though I agree that needs to be some security around Parliament, but I think the media needs to be allowed to do its job. And if we look at the makeup of Solomon Islanders, 80% of our people live in the rural areas. Not all of them can access Facebook. If you allow SIBC, then people in the provinces can also follow this discussion. Right now, I think a lot of Solomon Islanders don't know what we are talking about, and actually don't really care, to be honest with you. I think everybody's struggling with the everyday needs. Everyone's concerned that the schools have not started, and we've had now the second wave of the COVID community transmission now. The numbers are climbing, and also the access to just basic food and services, medicine in our clinics. Those are the issues that I think Solomon Islanders are worried about. And then you come to the capital, the discussion is way above their heads too, even for ordinary Solomon Island residents here in the capital. And I think what Peter said is true. Honiara is the trouble spot. Everywhere in the country, everything's pretty normal. Everyone's going about their business. I'm pretty sure there are women going to the garden right now, men going fishing, and they're not really worried about what's happening in the capital. But I think the narrative that needs to be it needs to be refocused, I think, very much on what Solomon Islanders need to get out of this this deal and whether it's good for us in the future or whether it's not. I think that's where we come from, especially in the media. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Dorothy. When we come back to you, can we ask you to speak up a little bit because we're having problems with the audio. But now let me turn to Honorable Danny Phillips to tell us a little bit about, the government's rationale into entering into a security agreement with China, and what were some of the things that were discussed in the background?
Thank you, Doc. Sorry about the little hiccup there, but I'd like to thank the organizers of this virtual discussions. In particular, I wish to mention Dr. Tara and from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and Professor Alan Tidwell of Washington, George Washington University in Washington, D.C., for their part in organizing this event. I'm so honored to be selected as one of the panelists to discuss the subject that has brought about so much interest, not only in the Asia Pacific region, but across the globe, particularly in the USA, China, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, I suppose, and in some of the Western democracies. The Pacific, as for centuries, has been a region for discoveries of the unknown, at least to the imperialist European powers, and later became the playground for hegemonic power struggles, which culminated in the Pacific War of 1942 to 1945 between the US and Japan. 80 years on this year, the US has truly forgotten about the countries in Melanesia, in which it had waged a vicious war, leaving tons of munitions, hazardous chemicals, wastes, and military hardware of various descriptions. Our people have been killed in numbers annually by UXOs, or unexploded ordinances, and other hazardous materials, not less nuclear fallouts such as in Micronesia. The Pacific, as we all know, is divided into three distinctive regions, namely Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. Out of the three, Melanesian, I think, is the most volatile due to its intense diversity, many languages, many dialects, myriads of customs and cultural norms and values, and the many intricate variations that exist. This makes governance become more challenging, complicated, and plain difficult at times. In contrast to our homogeneous neighbors in Polynesia and Micronesia. As we become independent states, we have sovereign boundaries, territorial boundaries, and we tried to govern ourselves politically and economically. And I must say, we do so with much challenges and difficulties. As we continue to govern ourselves, we discovered many unsuspecting problems related very much to our own diversity. We struggled to find ways of making our tribal lands, our cultural values, and systems to become more relevant to the requisites of modern economic development. This is why our development partners had often leave this to ourselves to deal with, because they say that it's more very complicated and sensitive. In the case of Solomon Islands, these unresolved fundamental reforms often developed into internal challenges that have become more serious and have political overtones, which cause social segregation that often develop into violence and destruction, and hence the need for establishment of strong and effective internal security apparatus and systems to underwrite and guarantee our development, economic development, investments, and national assets. This alone is the basis for the expanded scope of security arrangements between Solomon Islands and China. I'm very hopeful, much hopeful, that this should form the basis and the essence of our discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Danny Phillips. And I'll come back to this later on the question, and we'll circle back to some of the things that you mentioned. I want to bring in Dr. Transform Agorao. What are your initial thoughts on the agreement?
Yeah, okay. Good morning, Tasisis, and good morning, George, and good morning, fellow panelists. I take a somewhat middle of the line view, I think, between Peter Jr. and Dorothy and Danny, in that I personally don't really see anything wrong with the idea of an agreement with donors to support training and equipping our Royal Somaliland Police Force. And to that extent, I think we should welcome whatever assistance we can get from donors to develop the capacity of the Royal Somaliland Police Force to ensure that Solomon Islands is safe, law is enforced, and those who break the law are dealt with accordingly. And that our police force have the resources and wherewithal to do that. And I just happened to spend about a week this past week going to and fro from the Central Police Station. And so I really saw for myself that they do need resources. But I think what is important is that whatever support and arrangement we have for the security apparatus of Solomon Islands is coherent. And I think that is where one of the key issues. And it does not give rise to the opportunity for conflict amongst those who provide that support. And I think, unfortunately, because of the way in which it has been developed, the evolution of this particular arrangement has given rise to these different apparent conflicts of views. But I'd like to be able to see that, to that extent, perhaps the text of the agreement that we have, and it's probably water under the bridge now because it's been signed, could reflect this coherence a little better. Since we're not operating in a vacuum, as it were, there are regional considerations around which we operate. And while it might be true that we are friends to all and enemies to none, it's also important to remember that we can choose our friends, but not our neighbors. And therefore, I'd really like to see, what I'd hope to see was a broader package of support, perhaps along the lines of the agreement that we have for the Special Assistance Force, and also perhaps fashioned along the current defense cooperation arrangements that we have, so that these are designed more around supporting and complementing the role and the functions and the resources that the Royal Somaliland Police Force have. I know that there's going to be more specific questions, but I think there are two general observations that I'd like to make from the leaked document that I have seen. And I must add a caveat, because that is all that we have seen. No one has actually seen the signed copy. First and foremost, the issues such as assistance for humanitarian efforts and port visits by naval vessels, etc., actually do not need a security arrangement for China or for anyone to engage in those things. Those are things that are invariably done and facilitated in the course of the interaction between states as part of our diplomatic relations. But I think the concerning element of this arrangement, which we will discuss later, is the fact that it allows for armed Chinese personnel to secure the safety of Chinese nationals and assets. Albeit, I think it's important to mention, though, that it is qualified. It is not an unqualified provision. it is qualified to the extent that it is going to be, it has to be permitted by the Solomon Islands government to do that. And so there are, safeguards that are in place. But I think even with those safeguards in place, I think that from my own experience, having worked in foreign affairs before, it's unprecedented, and to me it represents for me a surrender of some of the fundamental functions of the Royal Somaliland Police Force. And so it's somewhat ironical to me, and I suspect that maybe perhaps not much thought was given, which operational details that you will find in the special assistance agreement. So yes, I agree. I mean, I think the other day, Tassis, you made the point that there are other agreements that China has in the region, security agreements, but I would be curious to know if they go to the extent that our agreement does in terms of having armed personnel protecting their nationals and assets, which I doubt. But broadly speaking, I think, I look at the Royal Somaliland Police Force and the function, and if China can provide training and equipment, then it should be welcome. But maybe perhaps limit that, limit the ability to provide armed personnel, which is unprecedented, which is, I think, causing. As to whether or not they're going to, that the agreement also provides for China to build a naval base in Somaliland, I doubt it. I don't read the agreement in those terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Transform. In terms of the other agreements in the Pacific, the one that I've seen so far is the Fiji agreement. It does not provide for security personnel from China to come into the Solomons or into Fiji, or for Chinese vessels into Fiji. It's a policing agreement as well as defense cooperation. But let me turn to what you mentioned about the part of the agreement that people from Australia, New Zealand, and so forth have been really concerned about. That is the part which says armed police, military personnel, and other law enforcement and armed forces from China to come to Solomon Islands. Let me turn to Peter. What are your thoughts on this? And particularly from Australia and the US, the concern that this could in the future lead to the establishment of a Chinese military base, or at least a naval base in the Solomons. Do you think that will happen? Or do you think there is a possibility that that could happen?
Thank you very much, Tara, Doctor. Yeah, I think, in listening to the other distinguished panelists, it's obvious that there are things that can be done that don't need an agreement. Many of the things like providing equipment to police and that don't need an agreement. These things come through the usual cooperation. Perhaps there's an MOU that's signed, usually at that level, that looks after that particular specific need that we have. But I go back again to our number of our police force. No, there's probably about 1,000. And now you're having a regional power in Australia training probably half of it, and then another global power training another half. For me, that doesn't make sense as well, in terms of such a small police force, but having the focus of two quite powerful partners in that space. I would think it makes more sense if we stick with one partner. Given our size, of course, our needs are vast. But when it comes to equipment and training, of course, I think the partners can talk amongst themselves as well and see where they can help. But when it comes to the actual part where boots on the ground part, that's where I feel this agreement benefits Beijing more than China, more than Honiara, because it gives so much to Beijing in terms of that particular aspect of it. And that is where an agreement is necessary. in terms of having that arrangement to be done in perhaps a broader framework. So that deals with sovereignty issues, effective control. These are concepts in international law that are very relevant in this particular conversation. So once again, the agreement itself, I don't see as beneficial to Solomon Islands, but it's beneficial to China and China's plans. I think for me, I see a straight line from the switch right down to what happened in the signing. For me, that was something that was already in the works, even before the switch, that this was going to be a foothold for an expanding, powerful China. And when you have an economic power, military might follows. That is a concept in history that no one disputes. And that is a natural progression. The idea is that for us, we already have alliances, arrangements, partnerships that can impact upon these expansions by a power like China. So the idea is that this particular agreement and how it leads towards a growing, more powerful China in our region is something that no one, I think, can dispute as well. And I feel that because of the switch and the immediate action that happened after the switch, we will all recall that Tulagi was a target in terms of a lease, that if not for its leak, nobody would have known as well that it was already signed, later to be annulled by the Attorney General. And reading through that lease, you could tell that it's talking about infrastructural logistical support, oil refineries, things like that to be built in a so-called economic zone. And we all know the importance of Tulagi to all our other colonizers that came. British, the Japanese were there, Americans were there. That was our initial capital. So it's a strategic importance to Solomon Islands. It's in the central province, the center of Solomon Islands. So for me, I see a straight line from those kinds of activities right down to just what happened according to the Prime Minister a few days ago, in which it was signed. And I think going by history, the recent history of China's rise in terms of military might as well, I wouldn't count it out. There's a possibility. I was in the UN when China started building on the Mischief Reef. 2012, we were hearing complaints starting to be raised by member states. And China explained that it was for fishermen to rest on a platform. 4 or 5 years later, there was a fully fledged militarized base on that. And that was also points out China was not telling the truth in terms of what it was saying. So this is something that, based on recent history, there's a possibility that this might happen here as well. And that's something that we should take very seriously. And of course, for us in the Solomons, the recent letter as well, whether it's true or not, from Isabel, an attempt again in Isabel, again for ports, those to me draw a direct beeline to what happened just a few days ago in terms of the security. And once again, I don't think we need it. There are corporations in place we can do through our normal diplomatic channels in terms of supporting our police. Once again, like I say, Solomon Islands is about 28,000 kilometers square in terms of landmass. Honiara itself is 22 square kilometers. Chinatown itself is less than 1 kilometer square. Why do we need another security country to provide security for us when we do know that the genesis of all the riots and the unrest have been political? We sort out the political issue, we sort out our security issue. It's going to be hard and tough, but we need to work there and focus where we need to focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Peter. Dorothy, and one of the issues that you brought up is that Tulagi and later on the Isabel, it's the same company, it's China Sam. And that company is now registered in the Solomons. During the Tulagi saga, I think it wasn't registered as a foreign investor in the Solomon Islands, but it is now registered. And we can come back to that later on, the role of companies at the front of a lot of this diplomatic relationship that's going on in the Solomons. But Dottie, on the issue of the naval base in the Solomons and the possibility, what are your thoughts on this?
Like Peter said, yes, there is a possibility based on history, if you look around the world. But then the Americans do have bases around the Pacific. And I think Australia is building a patrol boat base down in the border between us and Bougainville right now. It's not a military base, but it's a patrol boat base, which will have maybe armed personnel based down at the border there with the support of the Australian government. I think we really need to be focused a lot more on what we need right now, which is, and I agree with Transform when he says there are some things that we don't need treaties for, and then there's some things that we can just do as a normal process of a diplomatic relation with any country. But I think we also need to focus on what are the needs of our fellow countrymen. And I think the most basic would be health and education, I think. And if we had a more educated and a healthier society, I think we wouldn't be where we are today in terms of the way we react to issues like rights. We have nearly 67% of Solomon Islanders are between the age of 25 and 35. That's a very high number with no prospects at all. We push them to go to university, they come back, where are the jobs? And if there's to be any aid or assistance into this country, it should be focusing on that sector. And if you look at naval bases around establishing of it around the country, I think just development projects around the country is struggling to get a foothold. Bina in Malaita and other parts of the country, I think without traditional ownership of land, I think the Chinese will find this will be difficult if they decided to go down this road. But as you know, also is influence of social norms. We all think in a certain way because we have been exposed to a certain culture, a certain mindset, a certain system, because we have been exposed to it. Now, if we get more exposure to the way the Chinese operate, of them inside, will decide based on that acceptance, and that's because of the, like I said, if you're educated in Australia or the States or New Zealand or Fiji, there's certain social norms that you end up accepting. And in the Solomons, because 80% of our people are in the rural areas, it's hard for them to think the way Australians want them to think, or even Americans want them to think, let alone China. Now, if you're talking in military bases and you're dealing with customary land, that's going to be a difficult journey for anybody, even to just set up a business that brings in foreigners or even infrastructure into our rural areas would be very difficult. But then again, you can't rule out the possibility.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. Some would argue that, in fact, if you look at military presences around the world, in fact, China does not hold the record of military bases. Apart from the South China Sea, the Chinese base that we know of is in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. Whereas if you look at the case of the Pacific Islands, the military presence that we have has largely been by the US, by France in its territories, the US in places like Guam, in Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. And there are talks about the possibility of some kind of military presence in Palau. But sticking to the issue of military bases, I know, Transform, you mentioned earlier on that you think that it is unlikely. Why is that? Why do you think that it is unlikely that the Chinese will set up a naval or military base in Solomon Islands?
I think it's unlikely for the very reason that it's actually very difficult to secure land and space in Solomon Islands. We're struggling with BINA to build a tuna base there. And so, because land it's customary land, and so to the extent that it's fraught with those challenges, I think it is not as easy as people think it's going to be. Those of us from Solomon Islands know very, very well the difficulties of acquiring land, customary land. There's very little government land, I think, available to build any kind of military or naval base. And therefore, to that extent, I don't think that it is actually feasible and possible, given the nature of our land. But I would like to make a point that on this arrangement itself, I think it's unfortunate in many ways that it's primarily motivated by the November riots, even if they may have foreshadowed something like this earlier on. There is a lot that I always think about the Royal Somaliland Police Force and what they can actually benefit from training and other logistical support that not just China can provide, but other donors as well. And they're getting very important and strong support from Australia. They've been trained in the US, and so it's just unfortunate in the context of this arrangement that we should be framing these discussions around the November riots when there are other far more broader security challenges that Dorothy raised facing Solomon Islands that have often resulted in these riots. We need to, I see these riots just simply as a physical manifestation of the failure of successive governments in addressing some of the underlying concerns, not just faced by the current government, but faced by previous governments and are going to be faced by future governments. And therefore, we need to really ask ourselves the question, what are we doing about these issues and that are giving rise to these agitation? Now, for me, the riots and COVID-19 have simply revealed so many of the structural and governance weaknesses that our leaders and parliamentarians and officials have failed to address. You can go back right to pre-independence when people from the Western province were agitating for greater power sharing. And so there are many of these unresolved issues that are facing, and they're compounding because they're underlying ethnic tension issues. There's huge youth unemployment issues and the thousands of young people coming into the workforce every year. There's no jobs for them that are waiting for them. And so these are issues that are being delayed, addressing them. The delay in addressing these issues are only going to compound. There's the log of claims by the G province. There are the claims by the Malaita province. There's climate change and its impacts. And of course, with the bombs from Second World War, the tension that we had initially, people took up arms by using those old bombs, and so they do represent a security threat, and they have to be addressed. And so these tensions, all of these things represent a security risk. Plus, of course, the increasing marginalization of people from the government and what I have often described as the lack of inclusivity in our political and economic institutions, and also the role of our extractive industries. All of these issues are contributing to our security challenges. And if we don't address them, and if we pretend that they don't exist, and if we think that we're just going to address them by simply arming the Royal Somaliland Police Force, then we are really mistaken. Because the longer we delay in addressing the claims by the Guadalcanal people, addressing the youth unemployment issues, the more protracted, the more serious those problems are going to become. And so to that extent, I think we need to focus really on some of the internal issues that are facing the country that then won't give rise to these security issues in the future.
Thank you, Transform. I'm really conscious about time, but I want to give Honorable Danny Phillips the opportunity to address the concerns by our neighbors and development partners about the potential for the establishment of Chinese military presence in the Solomons. Honorable Danny Phillips.
I'd just like to say this, Doctor, that I think we are putting too much of our own words into the agreement. And we are debating around the periphery of the implications that we think might happen within the bounds of the agreement. As I mentioned in my opening statement, that the recent history of our country, in fact, the ethnic uprisings of 1999 has nothing to do with governance and good governance, and well, very little to do with that, and structural governance and all that kind of thing. I think the people of Guadalcanal are fed up with those of us who come from outside for having land and their space, and also desecrating their customs. I think that's the bottom line of the ethnic uprisings. But when the Townsville Agreement was articulated and signed in Townsville, we have all the militants who went and discussed and signed the Townsville Agreement. Much of the content of that agreement is a kind of skip the real issues that underlying the Guadalcanal tension, so to speak. But the issue about the Chinese militarization of Solomon Islands and the region is a little bit far-fetched, in the sense that the Belt and Road policy for China in mainland Eurasia and in Africa, and now they have the Maritime Silk Initiative in the Pacific for economic development and infrastructure. The second wave of violence that happened here in Solomon Islands was during the appointment election of Honorable Snyder Rainey, when Ramsey was still here, very much in full presence, and also our Royal Solomon Islands Police, and Chinatown and some of our hotels have been burnt down. And the latest one in November was the same. We have the presence of Australian police and maybe army personnel were here, and still we have Chinatown burned down. Secondly, I'd like to express that a very senior diplomat from the Australian High Commission said very plainly to us that their presence here is not to protect any Chinese interests. And this needs to be verified, but as a government, we know it was said to us in no uncertain terms that they are here not to protect Chinese investments, Chinese infrastructure. So that gives rise to other consideration in the minds of the Solomon Islands government to get the Chinese police to come in to train our own police. So there is an element of training our own police force, giving them the right gear and equipment to handle situations such that we have last November. And upon consultation, it carries on that the Commissioner of Police and our Royal Solomon Islands Police have also admitted that they will not be able to provide security such that is expected of the Chinese embassy to look after the embassy and Chinese and the personnel, Chinese staff, and all that in Honiara. As you know,
Honorable Danny, I don't want to be disrespectful here, but I'm really conscious about time. So are you saying that the security agreement was signed largely for the purposes of protecting Chinese, not so much for the security of Solomon Islands and Solomon Islanders? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's both. It's both for our own security as a country internally, and also for the interests of Chinese investment and infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. On the Townsville thing, I just want to set on record that I was one of the peace negotiators in Townsville. And, you know, I'm familiar with. I know there's a lot of questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is hand over to my colleague, Alan, who will harvest some of those questions and will ask the panelists. Alan.
Thanks very much, Tara. We have a range of questions. We have a lot. And what I'd like to do is maybe distill a couple of questions down and really get to the guts of them. Several posters have asked the question about process. There's interest in what is the process in Solomon Islands for negotiating a treaty, and for reviewing a treaty, for developing a treaty, and for communicating with the citizenry about a treaty. Is this an agreement in accordance with standard practice? Does it vary? Perhaps I could ask the panelists to comment on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you for coming on the Zoom program here. Yes, I think your question about security arrangements, is it a standard one? We don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but some of the things that Peter said in his comment is that some of the things that are included in the agreement are unnecessary, like what happens in disaster times and ships visiting a country that has diplomatic relations with whichever country. We have those kind of things in there. Dr. Tashistara cited an agreement with the Fiji agreement, security or defense agreement or whatever with China. So this is ours with China. We have a history, we have a background that needs a strong police and security apparatus to guarantee and to secure our investment and national assets.
Any of the other panelists would like to jump in on that?
Yes, thank you, Tara. If I can, just quickly on the process, but I think carrying on from Honorable Danny, the process in the Solomons is that it's very much an executive process. So the executive branch of government is the one that signs, ratifies treaties and agreements on behalf of the nation. There is very little, if no input from Parliament. So that is our process in Solomon Islands. It's a little bit different from other Pacific Island countries and democracies. But for us, this is my knowledge. I think Dr. Transform was also in Foreign Affairs. He could perhaps elaborate on that. But from my understanding is that it's very much an executive role that is done by the executive branch, cabinet, and they decide on behalf of the nation which agreements we sign up to, which ones we ratify. Thank you very much. Just on the process.
Any other questions, Alan?
Sorry, I just wanted to add quickly. Dr. Tara, that in the Foreign Relations Committee, we are looking very much at perhaps introducing a line where parliamentary, at least a committee, is involved in terms of our treaties, agreements as well. to have a role there as well. And that's something we're exploring quite seriously. And we have some recommendations that we might want to put to the executive branch on that particular process. Thank you very much.
I'm just to follow up, if I could, we had a question was associated with that body of questions about process was wondering at what point will Solomon Islanders be able to actually read the agreement that was signed between Beijing and Honiara? Presumably, we can read the agreement between Australia and Solomon Islands and any other international agreement that Solomon Islands has signed. But the question has come in, when can Solomon Islanders actually read the agreement?
I think that's a question for Honorable Danny Phillips.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Yeah, the agreement that was signed by the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Chinese Embassy is very much in the hands of the executive government at the moment. But in the context of what we are dealing with here, the agreement was signed and drawn up very much in the for the eyes of the government, like executive decision. That is correct. But in matters of national security, there are some things that do not need to be, I think, to have the whole country's legitimacy in terms of national security, such as, there are people in Australia who know very little about Pine Gap in the middle of the desert, the military base of the United States. There are agreements that open up all major ports in Australia that are not being seen by all the citizens of that country. So there are things, obviously, that needs to be seen by the executive government. And these things about the normal way of doing things in foreign policy, like the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in Parliament was saying, is true, that some of the treaties that needs to be ratified, like international treaties and other things, that the bilateral matters have the scope and understanding in the Biketeo Declaration and reaffirmed in the Boy Declaration, especially Article 4 and 5, that allows for individual countries to negotiate security for themselves, and also reaffirmed by the 48th Forum meeting of leaders in Apia. So yes, there is some question of processes, but I also understand that there is a scope, a regional scope for doing these things by Solomon Islands.
So Honorable Danny Phillips, very quickly, are you saying that this agreement will therefore not be made public?
I am not saying that, Doctor. What I'm saying that is I think that the government will decide to open the lid and for the country to see what's in the agreement sometimes later. But at the moment, it's still there. And I think the one question comes in here to say that is the agreement that has been signed is very different from the draft. I think it's very, very close to the actual document that has been signed.
Thank you. Alan, any more questions?
There is a question from a journalist from the Island Sun newspaper, Solomon Islands, Ben Bilua. And Ben has a series of questions, and I feel like I should really share those with you. And his first question is, do you think the China-Solomon security deal was signed under duress? And then his follow-up question is, what are the challenges for Solomon Islands to compromise China and allies' national security pacts, given that China and allies like Australia, New Zealand, and the US have differences? And then his third question is Solomon Islands at risk of trade trap diplomacy, given Solomon Islands relies very heavily on China when it comes to trade? So I think his concern essentially was the agreement signed under duress? What is the implications for the other allies and partners of Solomon Islands? And is debt trap diplomacy a concern? And I think that's for anyone on the panel. Ben doesn't indicate who he'd like to get to answer that.
Thank you, Alan. I'd like to comment a little bit on those questions. Yeah, I saw them. Absolutely, the agreement was not signed under duress. I think it's a mutual understanding between the two countries, having considered the internal details of the security aspect of our city here and also in the country. We do have a security base at the border, very much manned by the Australians, and they can put as many security posts as possible if this is allowable. But the agreement that we have with the PRC or China is very much conditional to the consent of the receiving government here in Solomon Islands. So no, it's not done under duress. And in terms of markets, 70% of Solomon Islands products or exports are bought by China. And that shows that there's a very important relationship in terms of economic livelihood with that country. And we also still appreciate the relationship we have with Australia under the Biketeo Declaration, and also at the exploration of the Regional Assistance Mission. We have an understanding that's signed between Australia and Solomon Islands. In any case, something of an ethnic related or a civil unrest, we will be calling upon Australia to help us quieting down situations here. But also, just quieting situations case by case is not the answer for Solomon Islands. We realize that. We have to work very hard on our fundamental reforms relating to land, to our customs and values. 700 people speaking 70 different dialects living on 1,000 islands is no easy feat. And that is the biggest challenge for leadership and for governance in Solomon Islands.
Great, thank you. Transform, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just want to make a point about the process, just to help with the listeners. When Ramsey was brought in, it was done under an agreement in which Solomon Islands signed. But the actual operationalization of that agreement to allow for the carrying of arms, the provision of immunity, etc., was actually facilitated through an act of Parliament. So I think there's an issue here in terms of process, in terms of the immunity. The immunity that's granted to Ramsey and also under the Special Assistance Force is provided for under the Facilitation Act. And to that extent, I would probably argue that this particular security arrangement, to the extent that it allows for the arms to be carried, should also be subjected to the same kind of legislative, protections and provisions in Parliament. So, to that extent, I don't think, just because this security arrangement is not covered under the Ramsey-led Facilitation Act of 2003. And so I think there are legal issues around it, which interesting legal issues and questions, I think, which Parliament should cater for, especially the carrying of arms, the use of force, the operationalization of those provisions where they come into, the command control, et cetera. Those are things that raise, they actually are legislated. And cabinet alone, I don't think, can actually guarantee those. Those are things that Parliament actually provides under the law, under laws that have to be developed.
Great, thank you. Other comments?
Thank you. And I just wanted to add on to that, if I can. Thank you very much, Alan. Is that the difference between having seen the draft and the Australian security arrangement in particular is the specificity. It's very specific, the Australian one. Very specific, and it lists down issues, including the ones that Dr. Transform just talked about. Issues about arms, issues about command, issues on customs, tax. These are included in that particular agreement. And I'm very well aware of it because I was charged of getting that agreement signed when I was Permanent Secretary. So it's very different from what I saw in the draft that we now understand from Honorable Danny is quite close to the signed one. So that is quite different. The open-endedness of the draft with China is what concerns me perhaps more than anything else, is the open interpretation to it. But I would just like to add that just like the Australian one, I need to confirm this, and with security treaties between sovereign states, they are usually also by practice deposited with the United Nations. And I would like to see this one also deposited with the United Nations. In that case, it'll be open to all to see, because that is how relations are. And security treaties have a particular standing in international order. And that is something that I would like to see if the government would do that, because that is by practice what happens between two states when they do a security arrangement as well. And we did that, if I recall correctly. I need to confirm that in New York after signing in Canberra with the Australian one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Others? I have another question from a journalist from Singapore, and this is from the Straits Times. The journalist asks, the US and Australia have framed their response to the security agreement in the context of the threat posed by China. Is this framing counterproductive? How should the US and Australia adjust their approach to this issue and the way they engage with the Solomon Islands and other Pacific Island countries? It's an interesting question, and again, it's open for whomever wants to jump on it. But that framing, the way it gets framed, this agreement gets framed in the context of strategic competition, is a particular kind of framing. Is it useful?
Thank you, Alan. I just like to make a brief comment on that. Yes, I saw that on the running track there. The question from Singapore. It's relevant that Australia has security arrangements with the United States and the ANZUS, and very recently they made some understanding with AUKUS, which is an understanding between Australia, New Zealand. Sorry, not New Zealand. And New Zealand was actually excluded under AUKUS. It's Australia, UK, and the United States on the militarization of beefing up Australia's capabilities, and also giving Australia a nuclear submarine, something like that. So yes, that's the big boys talking. We are just simply wanted to ensure that we have some guarantees of our economic development, of the peaceful coexistence of our people, and also trade with a country that is buying 70% of our products, which is actually the lifeline of our economy at the moment. But the agreement is a live document, and I totally agree with Francois Magarao and Peter Jr. KENILOREA that these things will have to be tabled and deposited in the depository of the United Nations at some later stage. I think the debate has taken gone the horse before the cat, a cat before the horse, so to speak. So these things are considered, and they will be coming into effect if the thinking of the government is to legalize it under some kind of laws or an act of parliament to facilitate it. Thank you.
Alan, I'm really conscious about time. We've gone over the 1 hour that we usually have, but if there are pressing questions that you think should be asked, then you know, we'll give a bit more time for it.
Well, I'd like to see if there was any other comment on the framing and strategic competition. Danny Phillip had a particular take. Does anyone want to comment on that? Okay, this is a question for Dorothy. When the Prime Minister and government refuse to engage with the local press, how do journalists ensure that the Solomon Islanders care about the China Solomon Island Security Pact enough to influence this debate over bread and butter issues? So, you know, effectively, I think what Kelvin Anthony is driving at is you know, what's the role for journalists in the context of this agreement in terms of trying to explain it and engage with the local community?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for the question. I think you also have to look at the makeup of our media industry here. Most of our media is privately owned and very small compared to, say, media in Papua New Guinea and Fiji. COVID has made it worse. There are some newsrooms that are now operating with 3, on some days 2 journalists. So that is a constraint that the media has. And then it's not made easy. It's actually made it harder for the media here to cover any issue because of the restrictions put in place by the COVID-19 restrictions. And then this issue now, it's become clear that the government still needs to understand the role of the media, work with the media, especially like we keep saying. I've listened to all of us talk and we keep saying we're a small country. And for a small country, we're really leaving 80% of our population out of the conversation. And I think if we want understanding on what the government intends to do with this agreement and whether it's going to benefit Solomon Islanders, then the conversation has to be started. It has to be opened. And the only way to do that is to work with the media and ensure that the media is in front, ensuring that Solomon Islanders understand the surrounding issues based on its intentions. I think I want to say to Danny that if government could hold press conferences in such a way the media is free to report. Now, if they have issues, I know the Prime Minister's office has issues with the interpretations of how the media come out and write stories from press conferences. Now, if you have an issue with that, then go online, go live, you know, live stream it if you have an issue with the way media is covering. But at least give an option for Solomon Islanders out there to follow the conversation, understand it, ask questions. I think that is the key to anything. That if you look back over the years when it comes to our rights, I think a lot of it was based on rumor, misperceptions on how issues are handled at the national executive level, like Transform was saying, explaining the process. How do these things work? Right now, there's a lot of even educated Solomon Islanders who think that national security issues should be discussed in the public. And as Peter has pointed out, that is not true. There are certain things that are not to be discussed in public, and it's within the power of the executive to decide such things. Now, if Solomon Islanders do not like what the government is doing, is where is the power of Solomon Islanders to create change or to make a difference in the way the leadership is driving this country, and it's in their voting. And we need to ensure that Solomon Islanders understand that. And that can only come if we discuss it and talk about it and give the power to the media to ensure that this information is going down into the rural areas and to people who cast votes. If you look at the voting registry for Solomon Islands, I'm telling you, people in Honiara don't control the number of people who vote. Who is in parliament today is not because of people voting in Honiara, or it's the educated elite determining that. It is because of the people in the rural area made these choices. So if we want to change it, where do we start? It has to be in the rural area. And it has to be, they have to understand that casting the vote doesn't mean it ends at you getting a bag of rice or your child gets school fees paid and all these sort of things. So it comes down to communication, understanding, awareness. The media here plays a very difficult role because we are also dealing with a population of people who don't understand 80% of these issues. So how can you report on a press conference that is based on the China and Solomon Security Treaty and make it relevant to a person sitting down in the village who wakes up every morning, goes fishing, comes back and feeds his family, and he doesn't really get it. So these are the issues that the media face. So I think the government needs to play a bigger role in ensuring that its citizens are better informed. I think if they did, we wouldn't be having this panel because Solomon Islanders wouldn't be up in arms about it. Maybe it'd be only Australia and the United States, because Solomon Islanders would understand why. Why is our country shifting from its traditional donor partners like Australia, UK, and I will not say US. US hasn't been around this area for quite a long time. So I'm going to say UK, New Zealand, Australia, Japan. They're the ones who've been around, and Solomon Islanders know. They see them in the rural areas. They're building bridges, they're building wharves, giving money to hospitals, clinics, schools. So see, these are the traditional donors that Solomon Islanders know. Now China's come in and they're already in the rural areas. They've taken visits out there, spoken to people, just looked around. So these kind of communication channels that we really, really need to look at. And I think Mr. Danny Philip, if you are able to, it would be very good for you to remind the government that the media is also part of this key, that if it wants to grow this country, that it needs to communicate it to Solomon Islanders. Thank you, Tara.
Really, really wonderful points, Dorothy. Thank you so much. On the note of the US being absent in the Solomons, there is a delegation from the US coming to Honiara, if not already there. I'm wondering what kind of reception they're going to receive and what are some of the discussions that might take place between Solomon Islands and the US. Any of the panelists?
Yeah, thank you, Tara. I think I'll take a bite on that one. You know, I think conversations and the dynamics will change now that the agreement is officially signed. The idea reading into the delegation was that they were joining what Australia was trying to do, New Zealand, as well as some of the Pacific Island countries, to try and get the government to not sign this agreement. But I think now that it's signed, I think the dynamics of the conversation might change. Of course, I don't know, but it's a new perhaps way of engagement now, knowing full well that the facts are already different from when they planned to visit. But I would just like to say that this is a trend, especially with the geopolitics at play. We know that before the switch, there was a conversation, perhaps one of the first in history, where our Prime Minister, then now also Honorable Sogavare, spoke with the then Vice President of the USA. And there was an undertaking to meet in Washington before the switch. Come and meet us before you switch. Make your own decisions after meeting us at least. That didn't happen. The switch happened before the meeting. Now we're having an agreement that was signed off even before a US high-level delegation arrives. So for me, I see a trend in terms of the geopolitics at play here with this particular agreement, and also between the two big powers of the world right now.
Any other comments? Alan, we are now nearly 1.5 hours into the conversation. So I'm really conscious about the time, but if there are pressing issues, Danny, sorry, go on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry about this, Doctor, but yes, we have huge issues here in this region in geopolitics. We switched to China at a time when there was some disagreements with the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. So understandably, the US concern about China moving into Solomon Islands is understandable. But with Dorothy, the role of the media in all this is well appreciated. We were once upon a time referred to as the mouse that roar by Robert Reed in the Island magazine. When Jeanette Dano was towed to Point Cruz Harbor for illegal fishing in a 200 economic zone. So the media has a lot to do with that. And we finally end up in perfecting a multilateral treaty arrangement for the United States or the American Tuna Association. And hence we have the headquarters of the Foreign Fisheries Agency here in Honiara. We also have initiated, because of the tensions of 1999, ethnic related ones, for the regional assistance missions which emanate from the Biketeo Declaration. So these are things that we initiated, not in a good way, but I think it does expose the need for regional cooperation. And the question I like to pose with the forum is maybe there is a scope, maybe there is room for the countries of the Pacific to come with an overarching understanding with regards to security, such as the Biketeo Declaration, but it's much more larger to encompass other security arrangements in the region, including the United States and Australia. I think that needs to be done. So because there is still the question of the Pacific Islands involved. There were some implications that we should talk to the Pacific first, to the forum, or we should talk to the United States first. So these things are, need to be weighed in the balance and need to be worked on. Thank you.
Alan, in the interest of time, can we have only one more question?
Sure.
And, yeah.
Sure. The question that's come in really concerns about Solomon Islands' willingness to sign other security agreements. And so the posed question is this. What does the panel think about the Solomon Islands signing a security agreement similar to the one signed with China, but doing so with the United States? Reactions? Do you think Solomon Islands should sign an agreement, a security agreement with the United States?
Alan, yes, I think we are open to all sorts of things. We beggars have no choices, and but we do not have ourselves open too much to the geopolitics in the region. We are very much mindful of the interplay between the superpowers in the Pacific, how it was played, Taiwan against China, Ukraine against Russia, and these other things do exist. And we do not want Solomon Islands, as small as we are, drawn into these geopolitical. But yes, the US has always been there, but for the first time ever, in 80 years, they've sent very high officials to the Solomon Islands at the moment. But yes, we are open. We have with arrangements with Australia, which is very much an Australian US mandated agreement with Australia. Remember, Australia is referred to by President Bush, I think, as the deputy sheriff of the United States in the Pacific. So there we are. We are already in the United States scope of understanding of national security for our country.
Thank you. Transform, did you have a hand up or?
Danny, I think, answered, but not to answer that question, but just to make the observation that it's probably best to have a comprehensive arrangement rather than, you know, different packages of arrangements. It just gets a bit more complicated. But the best security arrangement for Solomon Islands is one in which we all work with our donors, our partners, to help develop the country, address the myriad of governance and structural and infrastructure problems that would help us graduate out from our least development country status and provide jobs, security, and a worthwhile future for the young people of this country. I think that is what our focus really should be based around. And if there's a departing comments that I would like to make on this, and an appeal to those of you who are in political power at the moment, just think about the future and where is the future of this country, and where are we going in terms of the young people and their children, and how are they going to be able to live a comfortable life in this country. And it is up to us now to provide that kind of framework and grounding. United States and Australia to actually cooperate with us, not just Solomon Islands, but to provide a secure Pacific and provide a secure blue economy for the Pacific region. I think that's my parting comment, I think, about which I would like to see. If there's any future discussion on security, it should be framed around what is in the best interest of the young people who are going to be the ones who will have to live with the threat of climate change, all the challenges that we're leaving for them, you know, the environmental degradation that's going on from logging and mining and things that we're leaving, the legacy that we're leaving for them. They will have to live with all of that. Let us work and appeal with the donors to help them live comfortable and sustainable life.
Okay, there are still a lot of questions, but we do not have the time to answer all of them. I'm really sorry to those of you who ask questions, and unfortunately, we can't answer everything. But on the note that transform about final statements, I'm wondering if we could go around to the panelists and see if there are final remarks from the others. One of the things that I hear coming out a lot is, you know, in the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about the China-Solomon Island Security Agreement. But there are real domestic issues that Solomon Islands must address. Development issues that often have something to do with international relations, but often with governance issues within the country. I think that's coming through very, very clearly. But let's go around and ask the other panelists if they have final comments before we close.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tara, if I may. Thank you. I think in terms of just following on from what Dr. Transform just mentioned, I agree with him 100% in terms of our focus. And here I want to quote the late Kofi Annan in his landmark report in the UN, In Larger Freedom, where he said that development cannot happen without security. Security cannot happen without development. And both cannot flourish without respect for human rights and the rule of law. So that's the rule-based world that we live in that would guarantee us a larger freedom in terms of nations of the world to aspire to become and realize the potential that we all have. So the focus, I think, should be on the development side of the coin. That is where our security would come from. The idea about signing military or security treaties, this is good, you can discuss it, but I'd rather sign a massive development cooperation agreement with the USA rather than signing a security agreement with them and with our partners, knowing full well that the obligation of development rests 100% with us. We cannot depend on our donors and our partners to carry us along. It falls back on us. And that is a recognition that I think all too often falls by the wayside. And we always rely, this dependency syndrome comes in, even at the international level. So we need to get rid of that and focus on our own and really realize that it is up to us to develop our own nation and our own people, and our partners can support. Once we have our priorities fixed and right, I think there's a lot of goodwill out there for Solomon Islands that we can move forward. So once again, I would just like to emphasize again the development side. If we can push that up further, it will take care, I really believe that, of the security issues that we have. And also to look at the facts on the ground that much of the unrest have been politically related. If we can sort that out as well, in terms of finding mechanisms whereby outlets, pressures can be released or relieved, because we're going to have that in the future going forward. And that is something that is incumbent upon us leaders as well. And Honorable Danny, with his vast experience, I'm sure will be something that he would agree on, that we need to sort that out as well for us to help the security issues moving forward, because it has been very much politically motivated. I think we need predictability in terms of the outcomes of things we do. We need participatory democracy, where people feel that they have a voice as well. It's not just electing somebody and then waiting another 4 years again to exercise your right. I think we need to be exercising participatory democracy, and the role that Dorothy has and the media in terms of the awareness of that is very important. They need all the support they can get as well in terms of doing that role well as well. But that is my own take. We need to understand where we are in the world and what our advantages are, what our disadvantages are, place ourselves there, and then look forward on how best we can deal with the card that we are dealt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Peter. Dorothy.
Thank you, Tara. I think in closing, I'd like just to remind ourselves, Solomon Islanders especially, that I think development cannot come without education and health. I keep going back to those two as our basic needs, and that's what we need to focus on. You can't change somebody's voting habits unless they understand, and understanding comes through education. And a person makes decisions also based on how good or bad he feels in terms of his health. And we don't want to encourage Solomon Islanders to keep talking and expecting aid, like Peter said, but we have to go to the table as equal partners. And I think our approach with Australia has to change too. We need to say to Australia, look, if you want us, at least compromising on certain things, then there are certain things that Australia has to also compromise. And I'm talking about things like seasonal workers. Why hasn't the Pacific countries been given the privilege of having what they call them now, holiday working visas into Australia? We are their closest neighbors, 3 hours flight from Brisbane, and yet Pacific Islanders still struggle to get into Australia. And even just to go and become a seasonal worker is a very difficult thing for a young person. They have to go through a whole lot of process to get into Australia. Now, also, I would also like to highlight the fact that Australia needs to change its narrative. Stop referring to us as your backyard. We're not in your backyard. Yeah. I think if you change your narrative, maybe you get more acceptance on the ground here. And I think that's also influenced the way our leaders have been making decisions over the last 10 years. I know Ramsey has contributed a lot to this country, even though there are also a lot of people who criticize what Ramsey did, but I wouldn't be sitting here. And we wouldn't have homes in Honiara if it wasn't for Ramsey. They did, and like you said, 100%, there's never 100% a correct way of doing things. There may have been issues that they didn't correct, but that's not their role. Like Peter said, it comes back down to each and every Solomon Islander to ensure that we make the right decisions, we take the right steps to drive where we want to go. And I think I'd like to remind Solomon Islanders that this whole discussion of China must come back into what is it for Solomon Islanders. And we must also ensure that we are protected also under this treaty, that we do not have our rights abused, we don't have them walking all over us. And these are the kind of issues that the media needs to focus on, and we cannot focus on it unless we know what's in there, or if the government's talking to us, or if opposition is talking to us, or the independent group is talking to us. So I'd like to remind our political leaders that if you want the young people to understand what you're doing, you got to open the door and you got to keep the conversation going. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Dorothy. Transform, you have anything else to add?
Probably not, Tasisam. I think I'm probably summed up my own feeling about where things are at. So I'll just stop there to allow Danny to maybe sum up.
Thank you, Honorable Danny Phillips. Any final comments?
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. You know, we love this country very much, and I know you love your country too. And we only want the best for Solomon Islands and each people, and everything that happens here in our country needs to be for the best of our people in Solomon Islands. So my final remarks is very much in line with Peter, and the role of the media will be continued to appreciated to ensure that there is information enough for our people to appreciate what the government is doing. And there are, it doesn't mean that the government has done everything transparently, but I would like to say that we need to work very hard on some of the issues that are prevailing in our country at the moment. I hope that we will never again face another looting and burning in Chinatown and in our national assets, banks and hotels and things like this. So there needs to be a lot of information shared, and the role of the media is well appreciated in all this that is happening here. And we very much still like to be part of the bigger region, our Pacific Forum. We remain very strong in our support to the regional organization, and we also would like to say to Australia that Australia remains a partner of choice for many decades now, and all what we need is not to compromise what is happening with Australia. We keep talking with Australia. And when we keep talking with Australia, we know that we are talking to United States of America as well. So yes, those are my closing statements. And thank you very much for being part of this panel and to be able to contribute in the way I can in this event. Thank you so much, Dr. Tara. And thank you, Alan, for your coordinating role in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Danny. Before I hand over to my colleague, Alan, for his closing remarks, I just want to first apologize to people who had asked questions and we were not able to put your question out there, but please do accept my apologies. And secondly, let me thank our dear panelists for giving up your time, your knowledge, for being generous with your time and knowledge to be part of this. I see this as the beginning of conversations or part of conversations that have been going on among Solomon Islanders for a while now. And I hope that others will take it on and will continue to have this conversation. It's taken the University of Hawaii and Georgetown to get Solomon Islanders in a conversation like this. I'm hoping that others at home, including the Solomon Islands National University, can also organize conversations among Solomon Islanders. So thank you to our panelists, And thank you also to those of you who attended. We had over 300 people attend. We've been organizing our Blue Pacific Future series for a while now. This is the largest audience we've ever had. So thank you to all of you who came, who listened, and many of you stay until the end. But I'll hand it over to my colleague, Alan, for his final remarks.
Thank you, Tara. Let me echo your sentiments. My sincere thanks to the panel. What a wonderful presentations from all of you. I've learned so much. And Dorothy, I totally embrace your adoration and your advocacy for education. And so thank you so much. You provided education for an audience around the globe. And that's terrific. And Tara, I would just comment, that this is the largest panel that we've ever hosted. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we hosted a leader from the Prime Minister from the Pacific Islands. And that event didn't attract as many people as this event. And I think that just speaks to the importance and the concern and the interest of a very broad community. So once again, thank you so much. If you want to see a recording of this event, it'll appear on the YouTube channel for the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. And Tara, I think that you've probably got a way of getting it out to folks as well, but there will be a recording available. Thank you again all so much. It's time to say goodbye. Go back to your families, go back to work, go to bed, whatever you're doing. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.